The final item of business today is a members' business debate on motion number 8600 in the name of Stewart-Maxwell on Holocaust-Memorial-Day 2014. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put. I invite those members who wish to speak in the debate, please press the request to speak buttons now or as soon as possible. And if you're ready, Mr Maxwell, I would call on you to open the debate, please, 7 minutes or thereby.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Yesterday marked the 69th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the Nazi concentration camp that has come to symbolise the brutal state-sponsored persecution and mass murder of over 6 million Jewish men, women and children. The 27th of January has become the International Day of Commemoration in memory of the victims of the Holocaust. Now in its 14th year, Holocaust Memorial Day gives us all an opportunity to pause and to reflect on those atrocities, with commemoration events taking place in communities in Scotland and across the UK. In East Renfrewshire tonight, the Council is holding its annual Holocaust Memorial Day event at St Ninians High School. I represent East Renfrewshire as part of my West Scotland region, and it's also where I live with my family. Holocaust Memorial Day is always an important event in the area, as it is home to Scotland's largest Jewish community. This year, 2 senior pupils from each of East Renfrewshire's 7 secondary schools have been invited to talk about their experiences of the Lessons from Auschwitz initiative. As members know, the Lessons from Auschwitz project is organised by the Holocaust Educational Trust, with the support of the Scottish Government, to enable Scotland's young people to gain first-hand knowledge of the horrors of the Holocaust. I regret that I am not able to be at St Ninians this evening to hear the personal reflections of these young people and how their trip to Auschwitz has affected each of them. It's crucial that young people are given the chance to learn about the atrocities of the Holocaust to help them understand the importance of standing up to senseless hatred and discrimination. Having spoken with some of the pupils who have taken part in the Lessons from Auschwitz initiative, it is clear to me that it's a once-in-a-lifetime experience that will never be forgotten. It provides a vital link between the events of the past and the education of future generations. Last week, we heard from William Seaborn and Ruth Laird, 2 pupils from Queen Anne High School in Dunfermline, who delivered the time for reflection and told us about their experiences of visiting the former concentration camp. Ruth and William both provided moving accounts of the range of emotions they felt while seeing firsthand the setting for one of the darkest moments in our history. They described it as an eye-opening experience, the stories of those who lost their lives and those who managed to survive, both haunting and inspiring in equal measure. We have come a long way in the 69 years since the liberation of Auschwitz, though subsequent genocides in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia and Darfur show that we must be resolute in our determination to challenge prejudice, hatred and intolerance. The greatest weapon to protect against discrimination is education, which is why I believe that the work carried out by the Holocaust Educational Trust to preserve the lessons of the past is so valuable. The theme of Holocaust Memorial Day this year is, of course, journeys, and it offers a timely opportunity to pay tribute to the Holocaust survivors who managed to escape persecution and make new lives here in Scotland. The 9th of November 2013 marked the 75th anniversary of Kristallnacht. Known as the Night of Broken Glass, it commemorates the date when the Nazis launched a series of coordinated attacks on Jewish people throughout Germany and Austria, with thousands of Jewish homes, businesses and places of worship ransacked and burnt to the ground. Kristallnacht resulted in the deaths of hundreds of Jewish people during the attacks, with a further 30,000 Jews being forced from their homes and incarcerated at concentration camps. Many people consider it to mark the beginning of the Holocaust, and it subsequently led to the Kindertransport humanitarian rescue mission, which helped to save thousands of Jewish children from violent persecution. It's estimated that over 10,000 Jewish refugee children were separated from their parents and came to the UK as part of the Kindertransport initiative. Approximately 400 of these children came to live here in Scotland. We can only imagine what it must have felt like for these children to say goodbye to their parents as they left for places unknown. It helped them escape almost certain death, though for many they never got to see their parents ever again. A number of Kindertransport refugees stayed here in Scotland to start families and make new lives for themselves, greatly enriching our communities in the post-war years. Henry Wugger, aged just 15, came to Scotland as a Kindertransport refugee from Nuremberg, Germany in 1939. I had the honour of hearing Mr Ruger speak during an event held last year by the Association of Jewish Refugees at Garnet Hill Synagogue to commemorate the 75th anniversary of Kristallnacht. Now aged 89, Mr Ruger lives in East Renfrewshire with his wife, Ingrid, who is also a survivor of the Holocaust. They met each other after arriving in Scotland at a refugee club on Sauchiehall Street in Glasgow. They have lived in Scotland ever since, both now proud grandparents with 2 daughters and 4 grandsons. Mr Ruger was awarded an MBE for his work helping ex-servicemen and women who have lost limbs or the use of their limbs in the line of duty. He and his wife are also well known locally for their dedication to voluntary work and charitable causes over the years. Mr Ruger regularly visits schools to talk to pupils about Kindertransport and the traumatic and dangerous experiences of being a Jewish child living in Nazi Germany. His testimony is compelling and offers an invaluable insight into life as a Kindertransport refugee coming to Scotland during the Second World War. Of course, most of the Kindertransport survivors are now in their late 80s and 90s, and the sad fact is that for many it will be the last major anniversary that they can take part in. Now, I have spoken previously about Gathering the Voices, an archive project that records the first-hand accounts of men and women who fled Nazi persecution to come to Scotland. Mr Ruger's story is one of the many available through the project, ensuring that his testimony and many others are preserved for future generations. I am very proud to support the Gathering the Voices project and the work it's doing to help ensure that Holocaust survivors are not just remembered as victims, but also as people who were welcome to our country and contributed to making Scotland a better place to live. The atrocities of the Holocaust resulted in a loss of life that is almost too difficult to comprehend. It's right that we refuse to allow those deaths to be in vain. Holocaust-Memorial-Day allows us to remember those who lost their lives, but also gives us the opportunity to celebrate those who bravely resisted the Nazis and survived. It's a reminder that we all have a responsibility to stand up to prejudice, to hatred and to intolerance in our society. It's a reminder of the importance of doing all that we can to ensure that the lessons of the Holocaust are never forgotten. Thank you.
Many thanks. Now calling Ken McIntosh to be followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I thank Stewart-Maxwell for bringing forward today's debate and for recognising in his motion the excellent and very moving contribution from Ruth and William from Queen Anne High School at Question Time last week, at Reflection last week. Each year, Presiding Officer, we stop for perhaps too short a moment and reflect on the horrors of the Holocaust and on the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau. We think of all those who perished, the Roma, the gays, the mentally and physically disabled, and, of course, the Jews. Ruth and William spoke about one individual in particular. They spoke of Kitty Hart Moxon, who 70 years ago endured 2 years in Auschwitz and survived the death march through the Sudeten Mountains. She survived the Lublin ghetto and the Salzwedel concentration camp, and now, aged 88, she continues to make it her life's work to tell the story of that period, to remind us all of a time we must never forget. Her story is one of the many journeys recorded by the Holocaust Educational Trust, whose work, along with the Holocaust-Memorial-Day Trust, is so vital in ensuring that all of us know the true horror of that time and the genocide since. But, Presiding Officer, the human failings which led to the Holocaust are not limited to the past. In the last couple of weeks, I've been struck by a couple of French words or phrases which have come to my attention. Now, the first is simply the interesting coup de bleu, a typically attractive French expression used to describe the very unattractive depression, or blues, which left the First Lady in hospital. The second is the downright dangerous La Quenelle. This is the repressed or suppressed Nazi salute used recently by Nicholas Anelka to celebrate scoring a goal in a football match. And for those who are not familiar with the gesture, the best description I have seen of it compares La Quenelle to the way that Peter Sellers uses his left arm to stop his right arm doing a Nazi salute in Dr. Strangelove. The footballer denies any racist intent, but there's no doubting the link in many people's minds between the Quenelle gesture and anti-Semitism. I find it deeply worrying that in modern-day Europe, people are prepared to be photographed pulling La Quenelle in front of synagogues or former concentration camps. It's too easy for all of us to blame our woes on others or otherness, on immigrants from Eastern Europe, on Muslims or on Jews. Presiding Officer, I was shocked, as I know other members were too, by by the recent poll which found that 80% of young people and half of all adults cannot name a single genocide that has taken place since the Holocaust. A third of all adults cannot even provide a definition of genocide. This survey, these gestures, show why it is so important that we continue to mark Holocaust Memorial Day, because the lessons from that time remain as relevant today as ever. The theme for this year's Memorial Day is journeys, the journeys into the ghettos, the Kindertransport, excellently presented in Glasgow Central Station recently. The reunions in the years after the war, the audacious escapes by people like Jack Kagan in Poland, and the journeys of today too, thousands fleeing violence in Syria, Congo, Sudan and the Central African Republic. Can I thank all the members who have taken the time to sign the Book of Commitment from the Holocaust Educational Trust, pledging ourselves to recognise the humanity that is scarred by racism and remembering the sacrifices of those who preceded us. For those who have yet to do so, the book is still available in my office and will be there all week, and I'm privileged to support the motion before Parliament today.
Many thanks. Now call on Kenny Gibson to be followed by Jackson Charnell.
Presiding Officer, I'd like to congratulate Stewart-Maxwell on securing this debate and for the excellence of his opening speech. The Holocaust of Shoah was specifically a Jewish experience, and the full weight of Nazi terror was directed against the Jewish people. Last year I read two books on the Jewish communities of Europe before the Holocaust. On the Eve, The Jews of Europe Before the Second World War by Bernard Wasserstein, and Yiddish Civilization, The Rise and Fall of a Forgotten Nation by Paul Krivacek. On the Eve detailed the increasing sense of foreboding and impending catastrophe among many of Europe's Jewish communities in the late 1930s, caused not just by the rise of Hitler, but by growing and almost endemic anti-Semitism across much of Europe and feelings of claustrophobia as Jewish people seeking physical security, let alone a better life, often had nowhere to go. Countries across the world, including the US and UK, severely restricted Jewish immigration, while France and the Netherlands set up internment camps for Jews escaping from Germany. As portrayed in the 1976 film Voyage of the Damned, in 1939 the SS St. Louis carried 937 Jewish refugees from Hamburg to Cuba, which on arrival refused to take any, as did the US. Eventually, a few nations, including the UK, took several hundred refugees. The rest returned to Hamburg, and 254 later perished in the Holocaust. After Kristallnacht, in the months before the commencement of hostilities, the UK did allow some 10,000 unaccompanied Jewish children to come to the UK in what was known as a Kindertransport, which has already been mentioned. But most of these children became orphans when the parents they had to leave behind were murdered by the Nazis. The book Yiddish Civilization explored the incredible religious, cultural and political diversity of the Jewish people, one that lasted centuries and once numbered some 10 million people. The Holocaust, assimilation, immigration and decades of communist repression led to Yiddish becoming very much a minority language, although the culture does still live on and is undergoing something of a revival. Auschwitz-Birkenau was the largest concentration camp in Europe, and this death camp held over 90,000 prisoners. 90,000 prisoners at any one time. Between 1.1 and 1.6 million people are estimated to have been exterminated at Auschwitz-Birkenau during the war, 90% of those being of Jewish descent. The remainder being gypsies, Soviet prisoners of war, the disabled Polish patriots and those who acted against the Nazi regime. Auschwitz is the most notorious Nazi death camp, but ironically, probably because there were around 7,000 survivors who lived to tell the tale. A further 1.8 million Jewish men, women and children were exterminated in camps such as Belzec, Chelmno and Treblinka, where a total of only 42 people have known to have survived. Of the two survivors of Belzec, for example, out of 434,000 sent there, Chaim Hirschman was murdered the year after the war by anti-Semitic Poles. A further 3 million Jewish people were starved, beaten, shot or worked to death in labour camps, ghettos, or in huge forest massacres like Babi Yar in Ukraine, Ponari in Lithuania and Mali Trostenets in Belarus. Often local collaborators aided these killings, enriching themselves in the process. And there were many individual tragedies. For example, on the 24th of February 1942, the MV Struma, carrying 791 Jewish refugees and crew who had been refused access to the Palestine by the British, was sunk by a Soviet submarine and all but one person aboard died. But we should remember that there were many Jewish people who were heroic, not only in resisting the Nazis, such as the Bielski brothers, but also those people who fought to save their families, and indeed the many Gentiles who assisted them. But we should also realise that the Holocaust never left many of the people who suffered from it. Primo Levi, the writer, after he threw himself to his death in 1987, Elie Wiesel commented, "Primo Levi died at Auschwitz 40 years earlier." And Richard Glaser, the architect who survived Treblinka, was one of many others who killed himself. So it never left people. We must recognise those who suffered through the Holocaust, presiding officer, yet live on as a witness to the atrocities that occurred throughout Europe. The persecution teaches the horrifying consequence of unimpeded racism, hatred and bigotry, and the Holocaust-Memorial Day is a call to the people of Scotland to stand against prejudice and intolerance every day. As Robert Burns opined, man's inhumanity to man makes countless thousands mourn, and we must try and make the world a better place. Holocaust Memorial Day reminds us of the consequences of not so doing.
Many thanks. Now Colin Jackson-Carlaw, to be followed by Joan McAlpine.
Presiding officer, I have spoken before today of my own visit to Auschwitz-Birkenau in 2009, as have other members of their own visits across the years. At the time of my visit, a debate had begun, one touched with obvious controversy, on the future conservation of this Nazi concentration and death camp. For just as the shadows lengthen and those with first-hand recollections of what was suffered and by a few endured there pass into history, so too have the buildings which constitute the camps begun to rapidly disintegrate. Auschwitz-Birkenau, along with Dachau and Theresienstadt and a handful of other several dozen camps, remain, for 70 years serving not just as a testament to what was done, but also serving as a painful but necessary destination for those who had survived, to remember those who had not, and for the families of those who had survived to bear witness, and in some all too painful cases to speak words of farewell at the location of their forebears' darkest hours. Other camps, Sobibor and Treblinka, exist no more, ruthlessly demolished and concealed at a point in the rout of Nazi Germany when the retreat of Hitler's armies was not yet confused and panicked. Many have borne witness in this Parliament to Auschwitz-Birkenau and the striking and harrowing images, remnants and sense of evil that emanate from that place. Over 1 million died there, were murdered there. Today, the annual number of visitors exceeds that, and the infrastructure is crumbling. Since my visit in 2009, the number of buildings open to the public has been further restricted. And anyone with an eye for these things can see that it will soon not be safe for any of the buildings to be available to those visiting. The discussion over what to do has been resolved in favour of restoration. And this cannot have been easy, with the Polish government appealing for $150 million to preserve something so ghastly. It is a thought which, however correct, must have troubled the soul. It is on balance the right decision. Germany has pledged $80 million, the United States 15, Poland itself 13, and other countries, at least 23 in number, and including the United Kingdom, considerable sums in addition. Work has begun. By last summer, only 3 of the 45 brick barracks could be entered safely, and an immediate restoration of the others is underway at $1 million per barrack, each barrack having housed 700 victims at a time. The ruins of the gas chambers themselves, which were sinking significantly, have now had their foundations underpinned. The hundreds of thousands of personal effects, many of which have lain untouched since being collected and displayed decades ago, are now receiving individual attention. For example, each of the 100,000 shoes left behind at the war's end takes some 2 hours of careful cleaning, and even now the heart-stopping revelation of a note from history, the testament of one desperate individual discovered tucked into the sole of the shoe, and now 7 years later, 7 decades after liberation, brought to public light. I say it is the right decision with a heavy heart. It's not that I any longer believe that the history of Nazi Germany and its genocidal extermination of 6 million Jews across Europe can or will be forgotten. It's more because Auschwitz remains as a grotesque physical representation of what evil was capable of. It has to be seen to be believed in its scale and uncomfortably in its proximity to the normal life of those who lived adjacent to it and carried on in ignorance, fear or complicity in what was happening on the other side of the perimeter wall. It has evolved into a place of education and, in the darkest sense, of memorial. But it must surely be an exception, if not the only one. I can find far less excuse or rationalised argument for the debate arising from the gruesome find in the Bavarian National Museum in Munich of a Nazi guillotine used to behead one of Hitler's youngest and bravest opponents, Sophie Scholl, her brother Hans and other members of the White Rose Group in 1943. Perhaps 1,500 others were executed by this vile instrument as well. The options under consideration appear to be hiding it away or putting it on display. Franz Josef Müller, who at 89 is the last surviving member of the group, has argued that no entertainment should be made of their violent deaths. Surely he's right. What other than a puerile sense of the macabre will draw people to a museum exhibiting a guillotine, the blade and apparatus of which dispatched so many to their deaths? There is a sharp distinction between the restoration of Auschwitz-Birkenau, undertaken with the support of the international community, and the tawdry lust for a good turnout at a local town museum, however well-intentioned the exhibition's aims. All of those who died defenceless and without compassion or reason at the hands of the Nazis deserve to be honoured and remembered in perpetuity. Official memorials where tributes can be paid, or sites of historical significance, or much more personal tributes are appropriate. But as the shadows lengthen, as I said when I began my remarks, let us resist and argue against theatre and entertainment being made, inappropriately or unintentionally. Instead of hiding it away or displaying it, let this guillotine be destroyed. Presiding Officer, Stewart-Maxwell's motion, upon which I add my congratulations, invites us to celebrate the Holocaust survivors who have enriched Scotland as a nation and recommits us to ensuring that racism, sectarianism and bigotry are never allowed to go unchallenged in Scotland. Let us do that with respect, humility and determination.
Thank you very much. I call on John McAlpine to be followed by Hans-Alan Malik.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I too start by congratulating Stewart-Maxwell on securing this very important debate and the excellence of his speech, and indeed the excellence of all the speeches that have gone before. The stigmatisation of the Jews did not, of course, begin with the rise of Hitler. For many centuries, the Jews of Europe were marginalised and persecuted and called names, and it's that which led ultimately to them being slaughtered at a rate of 9,000 a day in the Nazi death factories. It is our duty, therefore, as Europeans, indeed as European citizens, to ensure that we fight anti-Semitism as a particular type of racism that's deeply embedded in our shared history. I'm pleased to say that its influence has been waning for many years, but we must not become complacent, and we must always be ready to root out this evil, which is Europe's great historical shame. And for that reason, I would very much endorse the concerns Ken McIntosh raised about it raising its head in our national game of football. Our Jewish community here in Scotland is small, but it will always remain an important part of our country's rich tapestries. One of the most notable members of that community is a man I particularly admired, the late Professor David Dachis of Edinburgh University, the son of a Lithuanian-born rabbi. Dachis' father believed that there was a strong mutual respect between Jews and Scottish Presbyterians, both of whom revered the Old Testament. He also noted that Scotland was one of the only countries in medieval Europe which never drafted a state law persecuting Jews. It's important that we continue to make no distinction between people on the grounds of their religion, culture, or colour or ethnicity. And it's quite significant that the Declaration of Arbroath, which tends to be remembered for other reasons, also has a little remembered passage in which it notes that God makes no distinction between Jew and Greek, Scotsman or Englishman. As I said earlier, there's never room for complacency, and in recent years we have seen attempts by small far-right groups to demonise other religions in the same way that Judaism has been demonised. We must all stand up against it, and I'm pleased that every party represented in this chamber has done so. With that in mind, I would like to use this debate to commemorate some of those who stood out against the evil of the Holocaust. Some of those have been household names, such as Oskar Schindler, but others are less well known, though their bravery is equally deserving of commemoration. While Oskar Schindler survived the war, many righteous Gentiles paid the ultimate price. One such individual was Jane Haining, a Scot from Dumfriesshire in the south of Scotland region I represent. Born in 1897 in Lockenhead Farm, Dunscore, she became a carer at a young age when her mother died in childbirth, leaving 7 children. After excelling academically at Dumfries Academy, she worked as a secretary in Glasgow and also for the church. And it was her church work and that love of children that took her to Budapest in Hungary in 1932, when she became matron of a school and home for orphan Jewish girls aged 6 to 16. There were 315 students in her charge, 48 of them boarders. When war broke out, the Church of Scotland advised its missionaries to leave Hungary, but Jane declined. She had heard stories of Nazi brutality towards Jewish people, and she wrote to a friend at the time, "If these children need me in days of sunshine, how much more do they need me in days of darkness?" Jane worked on despite police surveillance and with little food and resources. She made trips to the market at 5 a.m. to find food for her girls and patched up her students' worn-out shoes with her own leather suitcases. In March 1944, German troops overthrew the pro-Nazi government in Hungary, and in April of that year, Jane was arrested by the Gestapo. She was accused of working amongst Jews and showing sympathy for the children by crying when they were forced to wear the Star of David. She was sent to Auschwitz and never returned. She was dead within 3 months, August 1944. And one of the most shocking things reading about her death brought home to me was that in the 3 months when she was in Auschwitz, 1.3 million people died in that camp with her in those 3 months. Jane was one of millions, but every one of those millions murdered was a unique human being. Many more Jewish Scots have relatives who were murdered, and many more are themselves descended from Holocaust refugees. And other members have mentioned the Kindertransport initiative, in which young Jewish children were evacuated from occupied Europe after Kristallnacht. One of my most moving experiences as a journalist about 20 years ago was writing an anniversary piece about Kindertransport. And I went along and I interviewed a lady in Lanarkshire who had come to Scotland as a very young child, maybe about 5 or 6. By that time, she was an elderly lady with a Scottish husband and several children and grandchildren. She began to describe her earliest memories of Kristallnacht and witnessing as a 5-year-old a group of Nazi soldiers surrounding an old Jewish man. They taunted him, and she began to describe how they had taken out a lighter and set his beard on fire. And telling the story all those years later, she became completely traumatised, and we had to end the interview at that point. The scars had remained with that elderly lady all her life, and that's why we should not cover up the scar that the Holocaust left on Europe and the lives it snuffed out with such brutality. So I'll finish with the words of the late Ernest Levy, one of Scotland's leading Jewish citizens who, like Jane Haining, was taken from Budapest to Auschwitz. He explained why he wrote of his dreadful experiences. He said, "We are trying to tell the world so this cannot happen again, and we have learned a lot, although many have still not learned from the past." Thank you very much.
Thank you. I call on Hanzala Malik to be followed by Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you very much, and good evening, Presiding Officer. Please allow me to thank Stewart-Maxwell for securing this historic debate, Holocaust-Memorial-Day. Thank you very much for bringing this to the Chamber. Despite all the recorded history, there are still a few people who question whether this took place, and that in itself is quite horrible to me. I've seen films and documentaries, and I've seen and read books, and I used to wonder as a child how human beings can treat other human beings in this way. I could never really understand it, and I still don't understand it, despite the fact that I am a part of a minority community, and I have seen a very slight glimpse of what can happen when things go wrong. I've seen the heart of Europe being torn apart and genocide taking place in the modern world, so it's not very difficult to understand and believe what did happen. And in terms of the genocides that took place, the horror, the suffering, the pain, the inhumanity to humans, I have to say that it still moves me even today when I think about the difficulties and the hardship people went through. And it particularly moved me when I would see films affecting young children. And, you know, I'm sure they carried those scars all their lives after that, and how they actually lived a fruitful and meaningful life after that experience. I'm sure it was very, very difficult and challenging. And it's shameful that even despite all these experiences that people have seen, that people still continue to hurt one another. And I still don't understand why it happens. Ken McIntosh is quite right in pointing out some of the horrors that happen in Africa and other parts of the world today. And I always say to myself, why are we not learning the lessons? Why is it still going on? The UN does its best under very difficult circumstances. There's a lot of international politics that goes on. But what happened at the Holocaust was beyond what's happening in the world today. And I think it's very important that we never allow ourselves and anybody else to forget that if we allow hatred to perpetuate, it can go to that extreme. And that's, I think, something that I have always carried in my heart, that I will always be a witness, and I will always remind people of the slippery slope people can actually allow themselves to go down. Hatred, and the horror of continuous barbarity towards human beings needs to be challenged at all times. I knew some friends, Judith Tankle and Harry Tankle, were my heroes. They were an example of a Jewish family who worked in the community endlessly, and I used them on many occasions for advice and guidance. And their loss will always be a loss to me and the community. But I really need to say today that we should always remember our past, and we should always guard against the future to make sure that we do not allow human beings to go down the route that they did on that historical time. And therefore, Presiding Officer, all I really want to add to all the fine words that people have said here today is we should always stand up, be counted, always remind people of the horrors that took place so that we do not allow them to repeat themselves again. Thank you.
Many thanks. Thank you. Now call on Stewart Stevenson, after which we'll move to the closing speech from the Government.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and let me also congratulate Stewart-Maxwell on securing this debate. I join with others in recognising the Holocaust-Memorial-Day and the 69th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau. My family, of course, have been fortunate not to experience the trauma of the Holocaust, and I'm very grateful for that. However, it's at this time that we honour and remember the 6 million men, women and children less fortunate than ourselves who paid the price of Nazi oppression. Ken Gibson did make mention of some people beyond the Jews, gypsies and the disabled, but of course it was also people who were mentally ill, mentally disabled, and the gay. There was a wide range of people in that last 10% who suffered the ultimate fate of the hatred that the Nazis had for them. The Holocaust has touched Scotland in many ways. It continues to have lasting impact on our young generations. When last week we had Ruth Laird and Michael Seaborn speaking to Parliament, that was an appropriate thing for them to do. They came from Queen Anne High School that my mother actually taught at 80 plus years ago. And I'm sure she would have very much admired the spirit in which they spoke to Parliament. They tried to put themselves in other shoes and live some of the experience of people in the concentration camp. And one of them, of course, spoke of their great-uncle who was a survivor, whom he never met. But that was an important link to the past that youngsters have today. And for my part, I read my first political book. It was a biography of Lloyd George when I was 7. And I thought on the back of that, and through watching the Brains Trust on the BBC on a Sunday afternoon, where Jakob Bronowski, who used to refer in that forum to his family's experience at Auschwitz, that I should try and read some of the political books that had affected the 20th century. I started with Das Kapital in English, I hasten to add. I found that very difficult to read. And I got from the library, I got Mein Kampf. I managed to read 3 chapters before just my utter disgust at its content, because it got worse as you went on, meant that it was unreadable for me and intolerable to my sensibilities. Jakub Bronowski, of course, was a very intellectual man, covered a wide range of different subjects. He came to these islands in the 1920s and was not personally involved, but many of his relatives were. And when he recorded The Ascent of Man, a great history of the human race from its origins to its present situation, he visited Auschwitz. And one of the most moving things I've ever seen on television is Jakub Bronowski at the camp there. And he spoke off the cuff. He didn't use a script in this series at all. He wrote the book afterwards from what he spoke. He looked at the camera, said nothing, stooped down and put his hand in a puddle and lifted up mud. And looked at that mud in his hand and said, "This is my family." And that's the most moving thing I've ever seen on television. And it echoes with me to this very day. A survivor of the concentration camps, that means something to me as well, as a Russian Jew who left Russia at the time of the revolution because he criticised the new regime, and came, ironically, to Germany for safety, where he then subsequently criticised the Nazis and got put in concentration camp, was Jaco Trachtenberg, who used his time in concentration camp to keep himself sane, developing new mathematical algorithms for training young people how to do arithmetic. So some good has come. But we must protect the memory of the evil that happened in the Holocaust. I think the very last paragraph of the motion that's before us today, Presiding Officer, talks of the Holocaust survivors who have enriched Scotland as a nation, and recommits this Parliament to ensuring that racism, sectarianism and bigotry are never allowed to go unchallenged in Scotland. I look forward to what the Minister has to say. I'm sure it will be of interest. Presiding Officer.
Many thanks. And we now move to the closing speech from Cabinet Secretary Michael Russell. 7 minutes over.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I offer too my congratulations to Stewart-Maxwell for achieving this debate, and to all members who have participated. Quite clearly, this is a subject that unites all the members in this chamber and makes them think about the whole issues that it presents. The theme of today's Holocaust Memorial Day is journeys, and there is a sense in which we have all and will all talk about the journey of understanding that we have been on to understand the sheer scale, size and horror of the Holocaust, something that Mr. Malik referred to, the way in which it is difficult for the mind to grasp that horror. But journeys have other meanings too. There is the journey of genocide, which is represented by the end of the track at Birkenau, and I was there this year and I want to talk about that in a moment. But at the end of that track, there were 2 gas chambers, 2 enormous gas chambers, and one individual who chose, as people came out of the carts from which they had travelled across Europe, chose who lived and who died. And that was a journey of genocide. And it is an extraordinary fact that the vast majority of people who arrived at Auschwitz, at Birkenau, were dead within 2 hours. The vast majority. This was a real Holocaust, an enormous death which took place almost instantly. But journeys can be journeys of survival and of hope. There were some very few people who escaped from the camps. There were very, very few people, but there were some who were survived. Some escaped mentally by writing about what they saw and what they heard, even though, while in the camp, penalty for the possession of writing instruments was death. And journeys of survival have been referred to like the Kindertransport. 10,000 mainly Jewish children offered a new life in a new country, and about 400 of those settled in Scotland, many in Glasgow, and helped make this country the diverse and inclusive country that we have today. Last October, I went to Auschwitz with the Lessons from Auschwitz project organised by the Holocaust Educational Trust and part funded by the Scottish Government. Every year, the Scottish Government helps hundreds of S5 and S6 pupils make that journey and supports them to go on to be ambassadors for the project, teaching others about the importance of understanding and the importance of never forgetting. It is something I wanted to do, and I'm glad I've done, but I didn't aspire to do. And I think those who have been will recognise what I mean. It is an absolutely overwhelming experience, and the detail of that visit, the images of that visit in your mind will stay with you forever. Different aspects of the visit moved different people. For some, it was the poignancy of photographs of loved ones, those big displays of photographs of individuals who died there. In others, it is the things like the piles of shoes that were mentioned, and the two places in Auschwitz itself where you're not allowed to take photographs. One is in the gas chamber at the original Auschwitz camp, and the other is in a room which displays in a glass case, right along the length of the room, human hair. All that human hair that has come from individuals who died in the gas chambers and then went to stuff mattresses, which became a commodity. But for me, it was the symbols of journeys that were perhaps most touching. If you think for a moment what people expected when they went on the journey to a concentration camp and see what they took with them, then it is staggering. The people had their house keys in their pockets, which were taken away from them. People who left their homes and locked the doors, expecting to return home. And there is a room, too, that has along one wall cases, suitcases and bags. And many people in this chamber know I do a photograph every single day of something I see on a website called Blip Photo. And my photograph on the 30th of October last year was of that display of suitcases. And in the middle, a suitcase with a name on it. A number of the suitcases had names on it. The name Rafaela Sarah Tausuk. And that suitcase represented her personal journey from Vienna. She had a suitcase full of her possessions, her clothes, and it had her name on it. She thought she was being relocated. She thought she might go home. But she ended up on the railway tracks at Birkenau. She ended up in the gas chambers. The guides and members of the Holocaust Education Trust who take people round seek constantly to rehumanize what happens. That's why I want to mention her name. I mentioned it again, Rafaela Sarah Tausuk. I've never seen her photograph. She is on the major database, but I don't know what she looks like. But we should think of her as an individual with a rich life, a detailed life, and a woman who thought she was carrying on with her life, and it ended suddenly and arbitrarily in great distress. Now, those young people who take part in the Holocaust Educational Trust trips become ambassadors. Yesterday, I was with two of them in my own constituency in Tarbert Academy, Rose Richmond and Hannah Prill, and I went because they were holding an assembly, but also they had created an artwork of handprints, and I went to add my handprint. And that handprint is added to a canvas that says, "When we understand where prejudice leads, we can stop it in its tracks." And we'll come back to those railway tracks. If we understand where prejudice leads, where it leads, even the smallest prejudice can grow out of all expectation size, and it leads to death and to disaster. It leads in the end to Auschwitz. But it also leads to the end of those tracks and to the most memorable thing on the visit that I paid, certainly. Because at the end of the day, a very, very long day, a very cold day, in a site that is absolutely enormous, it's the size of it that really strikes you initially. And when the sky had cleared at the end of October and it was cold and became very dark, the whole group of us stood at the end of the railway tracks, between where the two enormous gas chambers are, with the tracks finishing there. And we all lit a small candle, and we had a small service led by Rabbi Andrew Shaw from a synagogue in the south of England. And he told his own personal story, and it was an astonishing story. And it takes in Glasgow because his grandfather and his grandmother were married in Vienna just in 1939. And they were told that, of course, their future was very doubtful indeed. And indeed, within a fortnight of being married, he had been arrested and taken away. And a neighbour of his grandmother's, a young woman, said to her, "If you stay, you will die. But I have a ticket to go somewhere. I have a ticket and a visa. Take it and go." And she did. And the place which she had never heard of was Glasgow. She found herself in Glasgow, and she had only just arrived in Glasgow when she fell ill and when in hospital discovered that she was pregnant. And she gave birth, and she knew nothing about what had happened to her husband at all. It transpired at the end of the war. Though she wrote to him every week, she told him how she was doing, he had died within a fortnight of arriving in Germany. But she felt and said to her children and to her grandchildren, that the real issues that came out of Auschwitz were not those issues of evil. The real issues that came out of Auschwitz were not prejudice. The real issues that came out of Auschwitz were pride and hope. Pride that survival took place, that despite the worst you could possibly imagine, the Jewish nation survived. Jews continued, Roma continued, life continued despite that, and hope. Because despite the worst that can be done to human beings by other human beings, there is still hope. So those were the odd things that I learnt myself at Auschwitz. And as we walked away from that moment, leaving our candle on the railway track and walked down towards the light, back into the world, you leave the whole thought of the Holocaust, not with despair, certainly with anguish, but not with despair, with a view that there is pride in the survival of the human race and hope for our future, that even such a great evil as the Holocaust, a great evil of continuing genocide, as Mr. McIntosh has referred, even those great evils do not extinguish humanity. And if we take that every single Holocaust Memorial Day, if we take that issue of our continuing journey to eliminate prejudice, then we take the right thing. And from that right thing, we can build a better world. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. I now close this meeting of Parliament.